The Crown killed the 63rd woman on a Wednesday. Cole Draven stood at the far end of the hall and watched her body fold. A noblewoman from the eastern coast, tall, proud, hands steady right up until the moment they weren't. She reached for the crown the way they all did, with that flicker of certainty in her eyes that said she believed she was different, that she was the one. The crown disagreed. Her scream lasted 4 seconds. Then her knees buckled, her eyes rolled back to show nothing but white, and she hit the marble floor with a sound that would live inside Cole's skull for the next 6 months. The healers rushed in. The court murmured. Someone's wine glass shattered against the tiles because the tray boy's hands had given out. Cole turned away and walked out through the side corridor where no one could see his face. 11 years, 63 women, the same result every single time. The crown of Ashenvale sat on its obsidian pedestal in the center of the great hall like it owned the room, which, in every way that mattered, it did. It was not a beautiful thing. Blackened silver twisted into shapes that looked almost like thorns, almost like veins, almost like fingers reaching for something they couldn't quite grip. 3 stones sat embedded in its front, the color of old blood, and they pulsed with a light so faint you could convince yourself you'd imagined it. Cole's mother had worn it for 19 years. It had loved her. That was the word the old texts used, and Cole had spent enough years studying those texts to know the word was not a metaphor. The crown was alive in some way that didn't fit neatly into any category the scholars had built. It bonded, it chose, it protected, and when Queen Vivian Draven died, it shut itself like a door slammed in the face of every woman who came after. Cole was 31 years old. He had been king since 20, alpha since the wolf in his blood had woken at 16 and torn through him with a force that cracked 3 of his ribs from the inside out. He ruled a kingdom of 4 million souls, spread across a territory that stretched from the Ashenmoor wetlands in the north to the Thornwall Mountains in the south. He had fought 2 border wars, survived 1 assassination attempt that left a scar running from his left ear to his collarbone, and negotiated a trade agreement with the southern realms that his own advisors said was impossible. None of it mattered without a queen. Not because of tradition, not because of sentiment, because the crown was the kingdom's engine, the wards that kept the borders sealed, the magic that fed the harvest wolves, the ancient pact between the Draven bloodline and the land itself. All of it ran through the crown, and the crown had been dormant for 11 years. The kingdom was dying in slow motion. Most people couldn't see it yet. The crops still grew, but thinner each year. The wolves still ran, but fewer pups survived each spring. The wardstones along the northern border flickered like candles in a draft. Cole's own power, the raw force of an alpha in his prime, was enough to hold things together. Barely, for now. But he was burning through himself to do it, and he could feel the bottom of that well getting closer every month. His beta, Simon Gray, found him in the corridor. "She'll live," Simon said. "The healers say no permanent damage. Probably." That word, probably, Cole had grown to hate it, with a patience that bordered on religious devotion. "Send the compensation to her family," Cole said. "Double the standard amount." "Already done." They walked in silence for a moment. Simon was the kind of man who could fill a silence without speaking, his presence alone carrying a weight that said everything his mouth didn't. He was tall, broad, dark-haired, built for war, and somehow wired for politics. He'd stood beside Cole since they were boys. He was the closest thing Cole had to a brother, and some days, the closest thing he had to a conscience. "The council wants to talk about ending the trials," Simon said. "No." "Cole." "I said no." Simon stopped walking. Cole walked 3 more steps before he stopped too, because Simon's stopping was Simon's version of grabbing someone by the collar. 63 women, Simon said. "The court physicians are running out of ways to say brain damage without using the words brain damage. The northern families are calling it blood sport. The southern realms are using it as propaganda. How many more?" Cole turned around. The scar on his neck caught the corridor torchlight and turned it into something that looked like a second mouth. "As many as it takes." "Until what?" Cole didn't answer. He had the answer, locked behind his teeth where it had lived since he was 17. The night his mother died, the night he held her hand while the crown's light faded from her eyes, and something passed between them that he still couldn't fully name. A knowing, a whisper, a single word that his mother pressed into his mind with the last pulse of her magic. Mate. The crown wasn't waiting for a worthy woman. It wasn't testing for power, bloodline, or royal bearing. It was waiting for one specific woman, the one whose soul was threaded to Cole's in a way that went deeper than biology, deeper than magic, all the way down to whatever bedrock the world itself was built on. His true mate. He hadn't told anyone, not Simon, not the council, not the court mystics who spent their days poring over ancient texts and coming up with theories that were sophisticated and elaborate and completely wrong, because telling them meant admitting something Cole wasn't ready to admit, that he might never find her, that she might already be dead, that the kingdom's survival was hanging on a thread so thin and so personal that it made a mockery of everything he'd built. The decree went out 3 days later, on a morning so cold the breath of the messenger wolves turned to ice before it left their mouths. Cole stood on the balcony of the great hall and watched the scrolls go out, carried by riders in every direction, nailed to every post and pillar in every village, town, and city across the realm. Open trials. Any woman, any bloodline, any age, any origin, any realm. No restrictions, no prerequisites, no bloodline verification, no magical aptitude test, no letters of recommendation from noble houses. If you were alive and willing to touch the crown, you were welcome to try. The fine print, which most people didn't read, offered 3 silver coins to every woman who participated, regardless of outcome. It was Cole's idea. Simon had argued against it, saying it would attract grifters and con artists who would fake their way through the line just for the payment. Cole had said good. Let them come. Let everyone come. Cast the net so wide that not a single woman in the known world could say she wasn't given the chance. Because somewhere out there, in some village or city or forest or wasteland that Cole couldn't see from his balcony, his mate was breathing, living, existing without any idea that a crown was waiting for her hands, and a king was waiting for her presence, and a kingdom was slowly dying for the lack of both. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, the roads to the capital were clogged with women of every description. Noble women in gilded carriages, warriors on horseback, farm girls on foot, elderly women who remembered Queen Vivian and believed they carried some trace of the old queen's blessing, young women who'd heard the stories and thought they sounded like adventure, and grifters. Simon was right about that. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, women who had no interest in the crown and every interest in the 3 silver coins. They came with rehearsed collapses and practiced screams, ready to touch the pedestal, fake a reaction, and collect their payment. Cole didn't care. Every woman who walked through those doors was one more chance, one more roll of the dice against odds that grew longer with every failure. He stopped attending the trials after the 70th woman fell, not because he'd given up, because watching had become a form of self-destruction he couldn't afford, and a king who couldn't stand upright was no use to anyone. He retreated to his war room and waited, and the crown sat on its pedestal, patient and silent and hungry, waiting for the hands it had been dreaming about for 11 years. The line stretched from the great hall doors, through the main courtyard, down the processional avenue, past the merchant quarter, and into the lower city, where it curved around the old well and disappeared into the crowd like a river losing itself in the sea. Nora Wren stood in that line for 7 hours. Her feet ached, her back ached, her pride, what little she had left of it, ached worst of all. She was not here for the crown. She was here for 3 silver coins. 3 coins would buy her passage south, to the port town of Greymere, where ships left daily for the Sunward Isles, and nobody asked your name or your bloodline or why your hands shook when you slept. 3 coins would buy her a new start in a place where the air didn't taste like ash and the ground didn't hold the bones of everyone she'd ever loved. She was 24 years old, half-breed. Her father had been a wolf, her mother had been human, and the combination had produced a daughter who fit neatly into neither world. No pack would claim her, because her blood was diluted. No human village fully trusted her because her reflexes were too fast, her hearing too sharp, her eyes catching light at night in ways that made the neighbors' children cry. She'd grown up in Millhaven, a border town so small it barely qualified as a dot on the kingdom's maps. Her mother, Ruth, had been a seamstress who drank more than she sewed and died in the back room of their house on a spring morning while Nora was out collecting herbs. Her brother, Daniel, had followed 2 years later, walking into the Ashenmore wetlands one autumn evening and never walking back out. Nora didn't look for him. She knew what the wetlands meant. She knew what walking into them without provisions or a coat meant. She buried an empty box beside her mother's grave and left Millhaven the next morning with 2 knives, 1 dress, and a talent she'd discovered by accident at 14. She could feel fractures, not just in bones, though that was how it had started, pressing her fingers against a neighbor's swollen wrist and knowing, without being told, exactly where the break was and how to set it. She could feel fractures in everything. In walls, in wagon wheels, in the invisible structures that held people together on the inside, the fault lines where grief met stubbornness and shame met survival. She became a bone setter, traveled from town to town, fixed what was broken, moved on, never stayed long enough for anyone to ask questions she didn't want to answer, and never let anyone close enough to become another grave she'd have to walk away from. The crown trials were just another job. Touch the pedestal, fold convincingly, collect the coins, disappear. She'd watched other grifters do it. The trick was in the timing. Too fast and the guards got suspicious. Too slow and the crown had time to actually do whatever it did to the real candidates. The sweet spot was 2 seconds of contact, a dramatic gasp, a controlled drop to one knee, and then the healers would rush in and she'd be shuffled off to the recovery tent, where a clerk with bored eyes would hand over the 3 silver coins. She rehearsed it in her head while the line moved forward, one agonizing body at a time. Touch, gasp, drop, coins, gone. Simple. The woman standing in front of Nora was named Helen, though Nora only learned that later. She was a duke's daughter, dressed in armor that had sapphires embedded in the shoulder plates, and she carried herself with the specific brand of confidence that only came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Helen walked up to the crown with her chin high and her hands steady. She made it within 3 feet of the pedestal before her body locked rigid. A sound like tearing metal came from somewhere inside her chest, and she dropped face first onto the marble. The guards surged forward. The healers ran. The crowd behind Nora compressed and expanded like a breathing thing, and in the chaos, a guard's hand landed on Nora's shoulder and shoved her forward. "Next," the guard said, in a voice that had said the same word 400 times that week, and would say it 400 more. Nora stumbled into the open space around the pedestal. The marble floor was still warm where Helen's body had been. The air smelled like copper and something older, something that lived in the back of Nora's throat and tasted like a memory she couldn't place. The crown sat on its pedestal. 3 dark stones, twisted silver, waiting. This was the moment she was supposed to perform. Touch, gasp, drop, coins. She reached out, and the crown reached back. Not heat, not pain, not the screaming, clawing force that had shattered 63 women before her. A hum, low, deep, vibrating through the bones of her fingers, up her wrist, into the arm she'd broken at 12 and never set quite right, past her shoulder and into her chest, where it settled against her ribcage like a cat finding its favorite spot on a cold night. The hum knew her. That was the only way she could describe it. Not recognized her, not identified her, knew her the way an old song knows the mouth that used to sing it. Nora's fingers closed around the crown. It lifted. It lifted like it weighed nothing, like it had been waiting to be weightless, like the 11 years of resistance and refusal and shattered minds had been the crown holding its breath, and now, With Nora's calloused fingers wrapped around its twisted silver frame, it exhaled. The great hall went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that pushes against your eardrums, that makes you aware of your own heartbeat in a way that feels like an accusation. 600 people stood in that hall, guards, healers, nobles, grifters, and not one of them made a sound. Nora stood there, the cursed crown in her hands, and thought about silver coins. That's what she thought about. Not destiny, not kingdom, not mate bonds or ancient magic, or any of the 1,000 things that were about to crash into her life and rearrange it into a shape she wouldn't recognize. She thought about whether the clerk in the recovery tent would still pay her the 3 coins, or whether lifting the crown disqualified her from the grifter's payout. A guard dropped his spear. The clatter broke the silence like a stone through glass, and the hall erupted. People were shouting. Some were crying. One woman near the back started laughing in a way that sounded like it might become screaming if nobody stopped her. The healers who had been rushing toward Nora skidded to a halt because their training covered collapses, seizures, and bleeding from the eyes, but nobody had trained them for this. A girl standing there holding the crown like a sack of flour. The head healer, a woman named Clara with gray hair and steadier hands than anyone deserved at her age, was the first to speak. "Put it down, child." Nora looked at her. "Can I still get the 3 coins?" Clara stared at her. Then she turned to the nearest guard and said, very clearly, "Get the king." They put Nora in a holding chamber. Not a cell, they were very careful to point out. A holding chamber, which was apparently different because it had a chair and a window, and the door locked from the outside with an apologetic click instead of a threatening one. Nora sat in the chair and examined her hands. They looked the same, calloused, scarred, the nail on her left ring finger still blackened from where she'd caught it in a door 3 weeks ago. Same hands that had set 200 bones, delivered 11 babies, and once punched a man in a tavern hard enough to dislocate her own thumb. But they felt different. Something under the skin was humming, not the crown's hum, that had stopped the moment she set it back on the pedestal. This was her own hum, a frequency she'd never noticed before, like discovering a room in your house that had always been there behind a wall you'd assumed was solid. She was still examining her hands when the door opened and Cole Draven walked in. The first thing Nora noticed was that he filled the doorway the way weather fills a valley. Not just physically, though he was tall enough and broad enough that the frame seemed to shrink around him. It was something else, a pressure, a gravity, a sense that the air in the room had been rearranged to accommodate his presence, and wasn't happy about the inconvenience. The second thing she noticed was the scar. It started behind his left ear and ran down his neck like a river on a map, disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt. It was old, healed, but it hadn't healed pretty. It had healed the way things heal when the person wearing them doesn't care about pretty, just functional. The third thing she noticed was that her hands had stopped humming and started shaking. Not fear, something worse, something that lived deeper than fear, in the basement of her body where she kept the things she never looked at. A pull, a recognition, a feeling like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing the ground was reaching up. She clenched her fists and shoved whatever it was back into its basement. Cole stood in the doorway and looked at her. He didn't speak for what felt like an entire season. His eyes were dark, almost black, the kind of eyes that didn't reflect light so much as absorb it and decide later whether to give it back. He looked at her the way she looked at fractures, reading, assessing, measuring the distance between what was visible and what was broken underneath. "You lifted it," he said. "Seemed light. It weighs 40 pounds. I've lifted heavier." A muscle in his jaw moved. It was the smallest possible physical response. But Nora was a bone setter, and bone setters learn to read muscles the way other people read books. That jaw muscle said he was fighting something. It said the fight was not going well. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nora Wren." "Where are you from?" "Millhaven. Border town. You've never heard of it." "I've heard of it." "Then you know it's not the kind of place that produces queens." The word hung in the room like smoke. Queen. It tasted foreign in Nora's mouth, like food from a country she'd never visited and had no plans to. Cole took one step into the room. Just one. But Nora felt that step in her sternum, a vibration that matched the hum she'd felt in the crown, and she understood with a clarity that made her want to throw the chair through the window and run. He felt it too. Whatever was happening in her body, whatever recognition was trying to claw its way out of the basement she'd locked it in, was happening in his body too. She could see it in the way he held himself, rigid, controlled, every muscle engaged in the act of not moving closer. The crown has a bonding mechanism, Cole said, and his voice had changed, flatter, more careful, like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed. It's tied to the Draven bloodline. It responds to a specific genetic and magical compatibility that the old texts describe as the mate bond. Nora stared at him. You're telling me I picked up a crown because I'm your soulmate. I'm telling you the crown believes you are. And what do you believe? Cole didn't answer. That jaw muscle moved again. Nora could have set a clock by it. You'll be given quarters, he said. Food, clothing, protection. The court will have questions. The council will have concerns. The trial process requires a formal verification period of, I don't want quarters. I don't want clothing. I want 3 silver coins and a road south. That's not possible anymore. Why not? Because every noble family in this kingdom just watched a half-breed bone setter from a border town lift a crown that has destroyed 63 women from the highest bloodlines in the realm. Half of them will want you dead by morning. The other half will want you married to their sons. Either way, walking out of this palace alone would be the last walk you ever took. Nora sat with that for a moment. She thought about Millhaven, about her mother's grave, about Daniel's empty box in the ground beside it, about every town she'd passed through in the last 6 years, never staying, never landing, never letting roots touch soil because roots meant staying, and staying meant losing, and she had lost enough for one lifetime. I can take care of myself. I'm sure you can, but the people who want you dead can also take care of themselves, and they have considerably more resources. He turned toward the door, stopped, turned back. His face did something complicated that Nora couldn't read, and she could read most faces the way she read bones, by feel. The formal announcement will be tomorrow, he said. I'll declare you as my true mate before the full court. I didn't agree to that. You lifted the crown. In the eyes of this kingdom, that is agreement. In my eyes, it was a mistake. Something crossed his face, fast, buried almost before it surfaced. Pain, real, unguarded pain, the kind that lives in the marrow and comes out sideways when you least expect it. Maybe, he said, but it's a mistake neither of us can take back. He left. The door clicked shut behind him. The lock engaged with that same apologetic sound, and Nora sat in the chair and pressed her shaking hands flat against her thighs and breathed. The formal announcement happened at noon the next day, in the great hall, with the crown back on its pedestal and every noble, advisor, general, and gossip in the kingdom packed into a room that suddenly felt much smaller than it was. Cole stood on the raised platform at the hall's northern end, dressed in the formal black and silver of the Draven line. Nora stood beside him, wearing borrowed clothes that fit like a compromise, close enough to pass, far enough from perfect to remind everyone present that this was not how things were supposed to go. Cole spoke clearly, without emotion, in a voice built for halls and battlefields. He told them the crown had chosen. He told them the mate bond was confirmed. He told them Nora Wren of Millhaven was his true mate and the future queen of the Ashenvale kingdom. The reaction was a living thing. The left side of the hall, where the old families sat, went rigid. Nora could feel their spines stiffening from 30 feet away, a collective recoil that moved through the nobility like a wave through wheat. The right side, where the military commanders and border lords sat, exchanged glances that were harder to read, calculation rather than outrage, assessment rather than rejection. In the back, where the common folk who'd been allowed in as witnesses stood shoulder to shoulder, someone cheered. It was quickly followed by several more cheers and one enthusiastic whistle that earned its owner a glare from a nearby guard. Cole's aunt, Margaret Draven, sat in the front row. She had held the regency during Cole's early years as king, managing the kingdom with a precision that Nora would later learn to respect and fear in equal measure. Margaret's face during the announcement was a masterwork of controlled expression. She smiled, she nodded, she applauded at the appropriate moment. Her eyes did none of those things. Nora watched Margaret the way she watched patients who swore they were fine while their bones ground together under the skin. There was a fracture in that woman, deep, structural, and load-bearing. Whatever Margaret had built her life around, this announcement had just put a crack in its foundation. After the formal words were done, and the hall erupted into the specific kind of chaos that follows any major royal declaration, a mix of political maneuvering, disguised as congratulations, and thinly veiled threats, dressed up as well-wishes, Nora found herself standing beside Cole in a brief pocket of silence while the crowd reshuffled. "You didn't mention the mate bond goes both ways," she said quietly. "It does. I mean, you didn't mention that I don't feel it." Cole looked at her. The scar on his neck caught the hall's light and held it. "Don't you?" Nora's hands hummed. She clenched them into fists. "3 silver coins," she said. "That's all I came for. I know. I'm going to want considerably more than 3 silver coins to deal with all of this." The corner of Cole's mouth moved. Not a smile. Something smaller and more dangerous. A crack in the wall he'd built around himself, just wide enough for light to leak through. "The crown comes with a salary," he said. "Does it come with dental?" Cole stared at her. Behind them, 600 people were rearranging the political landscape of an entire kingdom. Wars were being planned. Alliances were being redrawn. Assassinations were being penciled into calendars. And the future Queen of Ashenvale was asking about dental benefits. Something in Cole's chest, something that had been locked and frozen and carefully maintained in a state of suspended animation for 11 years, shifted, just a fraction, just enough to notice. "I'll look into it," he said. Nora nodded. She turned back to the crowd. Her hands were still shaking, but she'd gotten good at hiding that particular tremor a long time ago. 3 silver coins. That's what she'd come for. Instead, she'd gotten a crown, a king, a kingdom full of people who wanted her dead or married to their relatives, and a bond she could feel pulling at the basement door of her body like something alive and hungry and patient. She'd come for 3 silver coins and gotten a destiny she hadn't ordered, couldn't return, and had absolutely no idea what to do with. The crown hummed on its pedestal, low, satisfied, patient. It had been waiting 11 years. It could wait a little longer for her to catch up. The palace was a labyrinth, built by people who believed that confusion was a form of security. Hallways that curved when they should have been straight, staircases that led to floors that shouldn't have existed, rooms that changed purpose depending on who was asking and what day of the week it was. Nora memorized the exits first. Every door, every window, every servant's passage and maintenance corridor. She mapped them in her head the way she mapped fractures, by feel, by instinct, by the quiet certainty that knowing the way out was the only thing that had kept her alive this long. Her quarters were on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, a suite of rooms so large that Nora's entire house in Millhaven could have fit inside the bathroom. The bed was the size of a small country. The wardrobe was stocked with clothes that fit her perfectly, which meant someone had taken her measurements while she slept, and that thought made her skin crawl in ways she didn't have time to examine. On her first morning, she found 3 women waiting outside her door. They introduced themselves as her ladies-in-waiting, which was apparently a job title and not a description of their current activity, though it was both. Their names were Grace, Penelope, and Anne. They were daughters of noble families, sent to serve the future queen, and every single one of them was a spy. Nora knew this the way she knew a bone was cracked before her fingers found the break, the way they watched her, the way their questions were casual on the surface and surgical underneath. Grace asked about her hometown with the innocence of a girl making conversation, but the specific follow-up questions, about Nora's mother, about her brother, about why she'd left, had the precision of an interrogation. Penelope was quieter, more observational. She catalogued everything Nora touched, ate, read, and wore, and reported it somewhere Nora hadn't yet identified. Anne was the most dangerous, because Anne was genuinely kind, and genuine kindness in a palace full of liars was either a miracle or the most sophisticated weapon in the building. Nora let them watch. She gave them enough truth to keep their reports interesting and enough misdirection to keep the real truths buried. She talked about Millhaven, about bone setting, about the weather. She did not talk about the hum in her hands. She did not talk about the pull she felt every time Cole walked past her corridor, a pull that was getting stronger by the day, like a tide responding to a moon it couldn't see but couldn't ignore. She did not talk about the dreams. They'd started the night she lifted the crown, vivid, saturated, too real to be imagination and too strange to be memory. A forest she'd never visited, a river she'd never crossed, a voice calling her name in a language she didn't speak but somehow understood. And in every dream a wolf, enormous, white, with eyes the color of poured copper, watching her from a distance that shrank with each passing night. She woke from these dreams with her hands burning and the taste of old magic on her tongue, and she told no one. The court's response to Nora's existence followed a predictable pattern. The first week was shock. The second week was assessment. By the third week, the knives had come out, and they were not metaphorical. It started with small things: her food arriving cold, her bath drawn with water just this side of scalding, her riding horse swapped for a mare that spooked at shadows. Petty cruelties, the kind that powerful people use to remind powerless people where they stood. Nora handled them the way she handled dislocated joints. Calmly, clinically. She ate the cold food without complaint. She adjusted the bath temperature herself. She calmed the nervous mare with a hand on its neck and a voice that said she'd dealt with far more frightened creatures than a horse. The court watched her handle each insult with the same unruffled composure, and their assessment shifted. She wasn't going to break from petty cruelties. They would need to escalate. Edmund Hale was the first to try a direct approach. He was the son of Duke Hale, a family that had positioned their daughters for the crown for 3 generations and lost all of them to the pedestal. Edmund was 26, golden-haired, and carried himself with the specific arrogance of a man who had never been told that his face did not excuse his behavior. He challenged Nora to a sparring demonstration during a court gathering. The invitation was phrased as a friendly gesture, an opportunity for the future queen to show the court her combat abilities. Everyone present understood it was a public humiliation in a velvet glove. Nora accepted. They faced each other in the training yard, surrounded by a crowd that smelled like expensive perfume and quiet malice. Edmund was trained, well-trained. He moved with the fluid economy of someone who'd studied with masters since childhood, and he outweighed Nora by 60 pounds. Nora had never studied with a master. She'd learned to fight in tavern backrooms and border town alleys, and one memorable occasion in a ditch outside Millhaven, where 3 men had decided that a lone half-breed girl was easy prey. She lasted 8 seconds, not because she lost, because it took her 8 seconds to find the fracture in Edmund's stance, the slight overextension in his right shoulder that said old injury, compensated, still weak, and she drove her palm into it with the precise, practiced force of a woman who had spent a decade learning exactly how much pressure a human joint could take. Edmund's shoulder dislocated with a sound that silenced the crowd. He went to his knees. His face went white. His eyes went wide. And Nora, standing over the son of one of the most powerful families in the kingdom, reached down and set his shoulder back into place with hands as steady as stone. "You'll want to ice that," she said, "and stop overcompensating with your left. It's making the right worse." She walked off the training yard. The crowd parted for her, not out of respect, though there was some of that now, mixed in with the fear and the fury. They parted because they were recalculating, and recalculation required distance. Cole heard about the incident within the hour. He did not go to Nora. He did not congratulate her or scold her or offer any of the responses a reasonable person might have given. Instead, he sat in his war room with Simon and stared at the wall and felt the mate bond singing in his chest like a wire pulled taut. "She's making enemies," Simon said. "She's surviving." There's a difference between surviving and provoking. Is there? Simon looked at him with the expression of a man who had watched his best friend walk into a bonfire and decided that pointing out the flames was still worth trying. "The Hale family will demand compensation. Duke Hale has been building a coalition against her since the announcement. This gives him ammunition." "Let him have ammunition. Ammunition is useless without a target, and Nora is not the kind of target he's used to shooting at." "You sound almost proud." Cole didn't answer, but the wire in his chest hummed, and he didn't try to silence it. Margaret Draven invited Nora to tea on a Thursday afternoon. The invitation was written on cream-colored paper with gold leaf edges, and it arrived with a footman who bowed so deeply that Nora could see the bald spot on the top of his head. Nora went because refusing an invitation from the former regent was the equivalent of refusing a summons from the weather. You could do it, but the storm would come anyway, and it would remember your rudeness. Margaret's chambers were on the 4th floor, in the oldest part of the palace, where the walls were thick stone and the windows were narrow slits that let in light, like a miser handing out coins. The room itself was decorated with the careful elegance of someone who understood that true power didn't need to announce itself. Margaret was seated when Nora arrived. She was 62, silver-haired, and she had the kind of bone structure that made aging look like a deliberate artistic choice rather than a biological inevitability. Her eyes were the same dark shade as Cole's, but where Cole's eyes absorbed light, Margaret's reflected it back, sharper than it arrived. "Sit," Margaret said. Nora sat. Tea was poured. Small cakes were offered. The ritual of civilized conversation was observed with the precision of a diplomatic treaty, every word measured, every pause calculated, every sip of tea a beat in a performance that both women understood was not about tea. "You're from Millhaven," Margaret said. "You already know that." "I do. I also know your mother drank herself into an early grave, and your brother walked into the wetlands and didn't come back. I know you've been moving from town to town for 6 years, setting bones and avoiding attachment. I know you have no wolf, no pack, no family, and no resources. I know everything about you, Nora Wren, because I have had 3 weeks and considerable means to find it out." Nora set down her teacup. And I want you to understand something." Margaret leaned forward. Her eyes were very steady. "I held this kingdom together for 4 years, while Cole grew into his role. I managed the court, the military, the economy, and the endless, grinding, thankless work of governance, while a teenage boy learned how to be a king. I did this not because I wanted power, though I did, but because this kingdom needed someone competent at the helm, and I was competent. I believe you. I don't need your belief, I need your understanding. This kingdom runs on alliances, traditions, and the careful maintenance of power structures that have evolved over centuries. You are a disruption. The crown may have chosen you, but the crown is not the kingdom. The kingdom is people, and people do not adjust well to disruption. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you. There's a difference, though I understand if your background makes the distinction difficult." Nora felt the insult land. She let it sit. She'd taken worse from people who mattered less. "What do you want, Margaret?" "I want what I've always wanted: stability, continuity, a kingdom that survives. If you can provide that, then you and I will have no problems. If you cannot, then the crown's choice is irrelevant, because I will protect this kingdom from anyone who threatens it, including its queen." Nora stood up. She looked at Margaret, and she read the fracture. Deep, old, load-bearing. Margaret had built herself around this kingdom like a cast around a broken bone. and the arrival of a bone setter who could see through casts was a threat that went beyond politics. "Thank you for the tea," Nora said. She left. She walked back to her quarters. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of her enormous bed and pressed her palms flat against the mattress and felt the hum in her hands grow louder. The first real assassination attempt came 6 days later. It arrived in a basket of chocolates, delivered to Nora's room by a servant who couldn't meet her eyes. Beautifully wrapped, 12 pieces, each one decorated with edible gold leaf, and packed in a wooden box that smelled like cedar, and something else, something underneath the cedar, that sat on Nora's tongue like a warning. She picked up the first chocolate and brought it close enough to smell. Her nose wasn't as sharp as a full wolf's, but it was sharper than human, and the scent that rose from the candy was subtle, bitter, and achingly familiar. Nightshade, refined, concentrated, and hidden beneath layers of cocoa and sugar, with a sophistication that said this was not amateur work. Nora set the chocolate down. She examined the box, the wrapping, the ribbon. She found the maker's mark on the bottom of the box, a small stamp from a chocolate shop in the merchant quarter. She found the card, written in a hand that was deliberately generic, with congratulations that contained no name, no house seal, no identifying mark of any kind. Most people would have gone to the king. Most people would have raised the alarm, summoned the guards, demanded an investigation. Nora was not most people. She put on a plain cloak, left the palace through a servant's entrance she'd mapped on her second day, and walked to the chocolate shop in the merchant quarter. The owner was a nervous man named George, who sweated when Nora showed him the box, and nearly fainted when she asked who had ordered it. He gave her a name. That name led to a second name, which belonged to a minor lord in service to the Hale family. That lord's wife had a sister who worked in Margaret's household. The chain was thin but traceable, and Nora followed it with the patient precision of a woman who understood that fractures propagated along predictable lines. She did not break anything. She did not threaten anyone. She found each link in the chain and applied pressure, just enough to make each person understand that the bone setter from Millhaven could see exactly where they were cracked, and knew exactly how much force it would take to make the crack permanent. Within 48 hours, the minor lord had left the capital. His wife's sister had resigned from Margaret's household. The chocolate shop owner had decided to take an extended holiday, and the chain of people between the poison and its source had quietly dissolved, leaving no evidence, no witnesses, and no path for anyone to try again using the same route. Nora handled it the way she handled everything, quietly, precisely, alone. She told no one. Not her ladies-in-waiting, who would have reported it to their respective families. Not Simon, whose loyalty to Cole she trusted, but whose reaction she couldn't predict. Not Cole, because telling Cole would mean admitting she needed protection, and admitting she needed protection would mean admitting she was staying, and admitting she was staying would mean opening that basement door and facing whatever was behind it. So she locked the door tighter. She ate the cold food. She calmed the nervous horse. She mapped more exits. And she lay in bed at night with her hands burning and the white wolf in her dreams getting closer, and she pretended that none of it was real. Cole knew something had happened. He could feel it through the bond, a ripple of controlled fear that crossed the distance between his rooms and hers, like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't know the specifics. Nora had become remarkably good at transmitting exactly enough through the bond to confirm she was alive, while keeping everything else locked behind walls that even an alpha's senses couldn't penetrate. He stood at his window and looked out at the palace grounds and felt the ripple settle into something harder, something that wasn't fear anymore, but its older, meaner cousin. Resolve. Whoever had sent the chocolates had made a mistake. Not a big one, not the kind that got you caught. A smaller one, the kind that took time to become visible. They'd reminded Nora Wren what she was good at. And what Nora Wren was good at was finding fractures and deciding whether to heal them or make them worse. The crown started singing on a Monday. Not the low hum Nora had felt when she first lifted it. Something different, deeper, a frequency that lived below sound, below vibration, in the place where bone met marrow, and marrow met blood, and blood met whatever it was that made a person more than meat and electricity. Nora was walking through the east corridor when it started. She stumbled, caught herself on the wall, her vision doubled, tripled, then collapsed into a single pinpoint of white light that expanded outward until she could see again. But what she saw wasn't the corridor. She saw a forest, the same forest from her dreams. Ancient trees with trunks wider than houses, their roots plunging into earth so old it remembered when the world was young. A river running through the center, its water dark and still, and reflective, like a mirror laid flat on the ground. And standing at the river's edge, the white wolf, massive, impossible, its copper eyes fixed on her with an intelligence that was not animal, not human, but something else entirely. The vision lasted 3 seconds. When it ended, Nora was on her knees in the corridor, with her palms flat against the stone floor, and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Grace found her there. "My lady, are you well?" "Fine." Tripped. She did not trip. Something inside her had moved. Shifted, like a door that had been sealed for 24 years, developing a crack just wide enough to let light through. And the light was blinding, and the thing behind the door was awake, and it was not happy about the wait. Nora had been told all her life that she was wolfless, that the half-breed mix of wolf father and human mother had produced a daughter whose blood was too diluted to carry the shift. She'd believed it, because believing it was easier than hoping, and hoping was a luxury she'd given up the day she buried an empty box beside her mother's grave. The crown knew better. Whatever the crown had done when Nora lifted it, whatever ancient mechanism it had triggered, it had reached into the place where her wolf lived, not absent but buried, not dead but sleeping, sealed behind walls of diluted blood and childhood grief, and the kind of survival that only works if you stop expecting miracles. The walls were cracking. She could feel it in her body, her senses sharpening beyond what they'd always been, smells becoming languages, sounds acquiring color, the bond with Cole, the thing she'd been shoving into the basement with both hands, pressing against the walls of its containment like water against a dam. She started avoiding him, not difficult in a palace this size, but noticeable. Cole noticed, Simon noticed, Margaret certainly noticed, and Margaret noticing anything was the equivalent of a predator catching a scent. But Nora needed distance because proximity to Cole made the cracking faster. Every time he walked into a room, the wolf behind the door pressed harder. Every time his voice reached her through a wall or across a courtyard, the sealed place in her chest hummed louder. And if the door opened before she was ready, before she understood what she was becoming, then whatever came through would own her in a way she'd sworn nothing ever would again. Cole gave her the distance. Not happily, not easily. He gave it the way a man gives space to something he's terrified of losing, with clenched teeth and white knuckles and a nightly ritual of standing at his window and feeling the bond stretch thin between them, like a thread being pulled to its limit. Simon found him there on a Thursday night, staring at nothing. "You need to talk to her. She needs space. The kingdom needs a queen who's present. The coronation is in 3 weeks. The northern wards failed again yesterday, Cole." The whole eastern section collapsed for 6 hours. If the border wolves hadn't caught it, we'd have had a breach. Cole knew. He could feel the wards failing the way he could feel his own heartbeat, an irregular flutter where there should have been a steady pulse. The kingdom was running on his power alone, and his power wasn't enough, and it hadn't been enough for years, and the only thing that could fix it was sitting in the East Wing avoiding him, because touching the truth of what they were to each other terrified her more than any crown or kingdom or attempted poisoning. 3 weeks, Simon said. If the coronation doesn't restore the wards, we start losing territory. The southern realms have been moving troops to the border since last month. They're waiting for exactly this. I know. Then do something. Cole turned from the window. In the moonlight, with the scar on his neck silver white, and his eyes holding that absorbed darkness, he looked like something out of the old stories, not the romantic ones. The ones where kings paid for kingdoms with pieces of themselves, trading sleep and peace and ordinary human joy for the privilege of holding things together while everything tried to fall apart. "Arrange a meeting with the Northern Ward Keepers," Cole said, "and send a message to the Southern Realm's ambassador. Something polite, something that reminds them that our border wolves haven't forgotten how to bite. And Nora will come to me when she's ready, or she won't. And either way, the kingdom still needs defending." Simon left. Cole stood at the window. The bond hummed between him and the East Wing like a guitar string plucked once and left to vibrate in a silent room. Nora was not the only one cracking. The coalition against her had been growing since the announcement, watered by Duke Hale's money and Margaret's quiet maneuvering and the deep, structural resentment of a noble class that had spent generations positioning their daughters for a crown that had chosen a nobody. The alliance that formed was not unusual. In the long history of the Ashenvale Kingdom, nearly every monarch had faced at least one organized opposition during their reign. What was unusual was its composition. Simon Gray stood at its center. He hadn't planned it, he hadn't wanted it, but the pull of the thing was irresistible, a gravity built from legitimate concern, political calculation, and something darker that lived in the space between loyalty and self-preservation. Simon had loved Cole since they were boys. Not the way the court gossips whispered, though there was truth in some of those whispers, that Simon had learned to fold into small squares and store in pockets he never checked. He loved Cole the way you love the axis your world spins on, completely, helplessly, with the full understanding that the axis does not spin for you. For 15 years, Simon had been enough. The kingdom needed a beta, a right hand, a man who could stand in the gap between a young king and a hostile world and absorb the blows that would have broken someone less devoted. Simon had done that, gladly, thoroughly, without complaint and without expectation of anything beyond the privilege of being essential. Nora Wren was not a threat to his position. She was a threat to his necessity. If the crown worked, if the mate bond completed, if the wards and the magic and the ancient mechanisms of the kingdom snapped back into place, then Cole wouldn't need a man standing in the gap anymore. The gap would be filled, and Simon, who had built himself around being needed, the way Margaret had built herself around being competent, could feel the ground shifting under his feet. He didn't join the coalition. The coalition formed around him. Duke Hale recognized what Simon was feeling before Simon did, and began feeding it, not with arguments or persuasion, but with proximity, dinners, conversations, the slow, patient work of making a lonely man feel seen by the wrong people. Margaret supplied the strategic framework. She didn't trust Simon, she didn't trust anyone, but she recognized a useful piece when she saw one. Simon's closeness to Cole was the one advantage no amount of money or political maneuvering could buy. If the opposition needed an insider, Simon was the only candidate who could get close enough to matter. The plan was straightforward in concept and brutal in execution. The coronation ceremony, stripped of its old magic and reduced to theater, was the perfect moment. With the kingdom's attention focused on the crown and its new wearer, the opposition would move. Margaret's private guard, loyal to her rather than to Cole, the Hale family's armed retainers, 3 noble houses whose support had been secured through a combination of promises and threats, and Simon, standing beside Cole as he'd always stood, close enough to touch, close enough to act. The plan required one thing that none of them possessed: certainty that Nora was what she appeared to be, a wolfless half-breed whose connection to the crown was some anomaly, some fluke, some malfunction in an 11-year-old mechanism that had finally broken down and accepted the wrong candidate. Because if Nora was more than that, if the crown's choice was real, if the mate bond was genuine, and the magic was waking, and the girl from Millhaven was actually what the old text described as a paired alpha, then the plan wasn't just risky, it was suicide. But Simon looked at Nora and saw what everyone saw: calloused hands, no wolf, no power, a bone setter playing dress-up in a queen's chambers. He didn't look deeper. He couldn't afford to, because looking deeper would have meant seeing what Cole saw, what the crown saw, what the ancient magic threaded through every stone and root and ward in the kingdom saw. Something vast, something waking, something that had been waiting 24 years and was almost ready to open its eyes. The morning of the coronation arrived, wrapped in fog so thick the palace seemed to float in it, disconnected from the ground, from the city, from everything solid and real. Nora stood at her window and watched the fog erase the world, and thought about Millhaven. She thought about her mother's hands, red and rough from washing other people's clothes, wrapped around a bottle like a prayer. She thought about Daniel's laugh, the real one, not the forced one he wore in public, the one that came out when it was just the two of them in the kitchen and nothing was wrong yet. She thought about the empty box in the ground and the way the dirt had looked so hungry when she shoveled it in. She thought about running. The exits were mapped. The servants' passages were memorized. She could be through the palace walls and into the lower city before anyone noticed her bed was empty, and from there to the docks, and from there to anywhere that wasn't here. The hum in her hand said no. Not forcefully, not with the commanding authority of a crown or a king or a kingdom that needed her. Just a quiet, steady hum that said running was familiar and staying was not, and the unfamiliar thing was the right thing, and she already knew that, didn't she? She knew. She got dressed. She wore the coronation gown they'd made for her, white and silver, and it fit her like a sentence that took a long time to write but finally said what it meant. She braided her own hair because she didn't trust anyone else's hands near her neck. She slid one knife into the concealed sheath, sewn into the dress's inner lining, because a bone setter from Millhaven could become a queen, but she couldn't become stupid. She walked out of her chambers and into the hallway, where Grace and Penelope and Anne were waiting. They curtsied. Nora nodded. "Shall we?" she said. The great hall was full, 600 people, every seat occupied. The air smelled like beeswax candles and nervous sweat, and the particular metallic tang that magic left when it was close to the surface, pressed against the thin membrane between the visible world and the other one. The crown sat on its pedestal, 3 dark stones, twisted silver, waiting for the last time. Cole stood at the front of the hall, black and silver, the Draven colors. He looked like a man who had been holding a door shut with his body for 11 years and could feel the hinges about to give. He looked at Nora as she walked down the central aisle, and the bond between them did something it had never done before. It stopped pulling. It stopped tugging, demanding, insisting. It went quiet, perfectly still, the way the surface of a lake goes still in the moment before something enormous rises from below. Nora reached the pedestal. The court mystic, an elderly man named Arthur, whose voice sounded like parchment being unrolled, began the formal recitation. Words that were old when the palace was new. Phrases in the ancient tongue that Nora couldn't translate but could feel, vibrating in her bones like the crown's hum, amplified through centuries of repetition. She knew the ceremony had been stripped, Margaret's doing, Simon's endorsement, the council's approval. The old magic, the real coronation that would have connected Nora to the wards and the land and the deep roots of the kingdom's power, had been replaced with performance, pretty words, empty ritual, a show for the crowd that would put the crown on Nora's head as a symbol and nothing more. They'd removed the bloodline invocation, they'd removed the ward-binding oath, they'd removed the mate bond completion ceremony, the ancient exchange of power between king and queen that the old text described as the kingdom's heartbeat finding its rhythm. They'd left the shell and removed the engine. Nora picked up the crown. The hall held its breath. And the crown said no, not to Nora. The crown loved Nora. It had loved her since the moment her hands first touched its twisted silver frame. The crown said no to the stripped ceremony, no to the empty ritual, no to the centuries of magic being reduced to theater by people who feared what the full ceremony would unleash. The 3 stones in the crown's face blazed, not the faint pulse that Nora had seen before. Full, blazing light, the color of old blood gone white-hot, pouring from the stones like something had been building behind them for 11 years, and the dam had finally broken. The light hit Nora and went through her, not into her, through her, as if her body was a door the light had been looking for, and it was not going to stop at the threshold. It plunged through skin and bone and blood and marrow and found the sealed place in her chest where the wolf lived, and it didn't knock. It kicked the door down. Nora's knees buckled. The crown clattered on the pedestal. Her hands hit the marble floor, and the marble cracked under her palms, hairline fractures spreading outward from her fingers in a pattern that looked like roots, like branches, like the nervous system of something vast and alive. The shift came. Not the controlled, practiced shift of a trained wolf. Not the elegant transformation the noble families taught their children in private chambers with padded floors and patient instructors. This was raw, primal, a force that had been buried for 24 years, erupting through a body that had never been prepared for it, and the eruption was not gentle. Nora's bones broke and reformed, her muscles tore and rewove, her skin split and sealed and split again, and the pain was so complete, so absolute, so far beyond anything she had ever experienced that it circled back around to something that felt like clarity. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Nora Wren ceased to exist, and something else took her place. The wolf was white, pure blinding white, the color of fresh snow on a mountain that has never been climbed. It was wrong-sized, too large, too heavy, too present. It filled the space where Nora had been standing, and then some, its shoulders level with the pedestal, its copper eyes surveying the hall with an intelligence that made 600 people simultaneously understand that they were not the most dangerous thing in the room. The hall went beyond silent. It went still, the kind of stillness that prey animals achieve when they realize the predator is already close enough to strike. The wolf turned its copper eyes to Cole. Cole looked back. His own wolf was roaring inside him, not in challenge, in recognition, in the bone-deep, blood-deep, marrow-deep certainty that this was the other half of something that had been waiting a very long time to be whole. The coup launched. Simon moved first. He'd been standing 3 feet behind Cole, in the position he'd occupied for 15 years, close enough to touch, close enough to act. His hand went to the weapon concealed beneath his formal jacket, a short blade treated with wolfsbane, and his fingers closed around the grip, and his arm began to rise. He made it halfway. Cole turned, not because he'd sensed the movement, because the bond, the fully awakened mate bond that was now singing between him and Nora with a force that shook dust from the rafters, told him exactly where the threat was. The bond was a compass, and a map, and a battle plan, all compressed into a single pulse of knowing. Cole's hand caught Simon's wrist. The bones ground together. Simon's face did something that Cole would remember for the rest of his life, a mixture of pain and relief, and the terrible freedom of a man whose secret has finally been dragged into daylight. "I'm sorry," Simon said. Cole broke his wrist, neatly, precisely, with exactly the amount of force required, and not 1 ounce more. The blade clattered to the floor. Then the rest hit. Margaret's private guard surged from the east entrance, 30 armed men in formation, moving with the coordinated precision of soldiers who had rehearsed this maneuver many times in many rooms that Margaret owned and Cole didn't know about. The Hale family's retainers came from the west, another 20, and 3 noble houses' men poured from the main doors, cutting off the crowd's retreat. 70 armed men against a king, a bone-setter who was currently a gigantic white wolf, and whatever loyalists were scattered through the panicking crowd. The numbers should have been decisive. The plan should have worked. The plan did not account for what the old texts called paired ruin. When a true mated pair fights together for the first time with the bond fully open, the two halves become something that is not simply additive. It is multiplicative. Each one knows where the other is, what the other sees, what the other needs. There is no communication delay, no misread signal, no gap between intention and execution. It is a single mind driving 2 bodies, and both bodies are built for war. Cole shifted. His wolf was black, enormous, scarred, a creature that had spent 15 years fighting border wars and political battles, and the slow grinding attrition of holding a kingdom together with nothing but raw force. It was not beautiful. It was functional, built for endurance, for impact, for the long fight. The white wolf and the black wolf hit Margaret's guard at the same time from different angles. The formation collapsed in 4 seconds. What followed was not a battle. A battle implies two sides with a roughly equivalent capacity for harm. This was a correction. The wolves moved through the opposition with the systematic precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. Each strike calculated, each movement coordinated through the bond with a fluidity that made the watching crowd forget to breathe. Cole took the left flank, Nora took the right. They moved in concert, a pattern that looked choreographed but was something stranger and more intimate. Two bodies responding to a single shared awareness that knew where every threat was, where every ally stood, and exactly how much force was needed to end each engagement without ending any lives. Because they didn't end lives, not one. The wolves fought with a restraint that was itself a message, a demonstration that the power they wielded was precise enough to distinguish between an enemy who needed to be stopped and an enemy who needed to be destroyed, and that the choice between the two was theirs to make. The Hale retainers broke first. They scattered through the main doors, dropping their weapons as they ran. The 3 noble houses men followed within seconds, their resolve evaporating in the face of something they had never been trained to fight, because nothing like it had existed in living memory. Margaret's guard held the longest, because Margaret's guard was Margaret's, and Margaret did not employ men who ran. They held until the black wolf and the white wolf converged on their positions simultaneously, and the sonic force of 2 paired alphas snarling in unison hit them with a pressure wave that dropped every one of them to their knees. It was over in 90 seconds. The great hall looked like the aftermath of something that couldn't decide whether it was a storm or a surgery. Dropped weapons littered the marble. Unconscious guards lay in positions that would require considerable chiropractic attention. The crowd, pressed against the walls and frozen in various stages of terror and awe, stared at the 2 wolves standing in the center of the hall, with the particular expression of people who had just watched the rules of their world get rewritten in real time. The white wolf shifted back first. Nora stood in the ruins of her coronation gown, breathing hard, with crown light still fading from her eyes, and her hands steady for the first time in weeks. The hum was gone, not because it had stopped, but because it had become so thoroughly a part of her that distinguishing it from her own heartbeat was no longer possible. She looked at Cole. He shifted back, standing across the hall from her, blood on his hands, from a cut he'd taken on the left flank, his scar catching the light from the still blazing crown. The bond between them was a river, wide, deep, irreversible. It carried everything they'd been holding back, every suppressed pull, every denied recognition, every night spent on opposite sides of the palace, pretending the distance was something they'd chosen, rather than something they were hiding behind. Neither of them moved. The hall waited. Nora walked to the pedestal. She picked up the crown for the second time. It didn't hum. It sang, full-throated, joyful, the sound of an instrument finding the hands it was made for after years of silence. She put it on. The wards lit up, not gradually, not with the slow, creeping restoration the court mystics had predicted even in their most optimistic scenarios. The wards exploded back to life. Every stone, every boundary, every invisible line of force that protected the kingdom from the world outside, all of them firing simultaneously with a pulse of power that could be felt in every corner of the realm. In the north, the border wolves howled, not in alarm, in relief. The sound carried across the wetlands and into the mountains and back again, a chorus of recognition that said the queen was crowned, the bond was complete, the kingdom's heart was beating again. In the south, the troops that the southern realms had been moving to the border stopped. Their commanders felt the wards snap back into place like a wall slamming shut, and they understood with military clarity that the window they'd been watching for had just closed permanently. In Millhaven, where Nora's mother's grave sat beside an empty box in a small cemetery behind the old church, a single white flower pushed through the frozen ground. Margaret Draven was found in the east corridor, walking calmly toward the exit. She was not running. She did not run. She walked with the measured pace of a woman who had gambled everything on a calculation that turned out to be wrong, and was now dealing with the consequences the same way she dealt with everything, methodically. She looked at the guards who stopped her. She looked past them at Cole, who stood at the corridor's end, with blood on his hands and something in his eyes that was harder to read than rage. "I did what I believed was necessary," Margaret said. Cole said nothing. He gestured to the guards. They led her away. Simon was sitting on the hall floor with his broken wrist cradled against his chest when Nora found him. The fight was over. The crowd was being cleared. Healers were moving through the fallen guards with efficient hands and carefully neutral expressions. Simon looked up at her. His face was raw, stripped. Every defense and performance and carefully maintained surface peeled away, leaving nothing but the thing underneath. A man who had loved someone so completely that the arrival of competition had turned the love into something it was never meant to become. Nora knelt beside him. She took his broken wrist in her hands. Her fingers found the fracture. Clean, precise, exactly the kind of break Cole would make, controlled even in combat, damaging without destroying. She said it, quickly, expertly. Simon flinched once, and then went still. "You'll need to keep it immobilized for 6 weeks," Nora said. "And stop carrying weapons under your jacket. The shoulder holster was pulling your left trapezius out of alignment." Simon stared at her. Then something happened to his face that might have been the beginning of a laugh or the end of a sob, and he closed his eyes and said nothing. Nora stood up. She walked across the hall to where Cole stood by the pedestal, looking at the crown's empty place. His hands were at his sides. His wolf was quiet inside him, not sleeping, settled, the way a guard dog settles when it knows the perimeter is secure. Nora stopped 3 feet from him. The bond between them was so present, so tangible, so woven into the air between their bodies that she could almost see it, a shimmer, a heat haze, a distortion in the light that said something real existed in that space, even if the eye couldn't quite resolve it. "I didn't come here for this," she said. "I know. I came for 3 silver coins. I know. This is not what I ordered. No." She looked at him. He looked at her. The hall was emptying around them, guards and healers and courtiers filing out with the stunned, shuffling gait of people who needed to sit down and rethink several fundamental assumptions about the world. "I'm going to be a terrible queen," Nora said. "Probably. I don't know anything about politics, or diplomacy, or which fork to use at state dinners. There are people who can teach you. I dislocated a duke's son's shoulder in front of the entire court. He deserved it. I tracked down an assassination plot without telling anyone and handled it myself. That concerns me more than the shoulder. I have a wolf the size of a small horse, and I've had it for approximately 15 minutes, and I have no idea how to control it. We'll figure it out." "We." The word sat between them, small and heavy and loaded with everything it implied. Not I, not you, we, a word that required 2 people and a willingness to remain in proximity, and the kind of trust that Nora had spent 6 years dismantling because trust was a luxury, and luxuries were things you lost. "I need you to understand something," Nora said. "I don't know how to do this, any of it, the crown, the kingdom, the bond. I don't know how to stay. I've never stayed anywhere. Staying is the thing I'm worst at." Cole looked at her hands. The ones that had lifted the crown, the ones that had set bones and tracked down assassins and cracked marble floors with their bare palms. The hands that were not shaking, for the first time since they'd met. "I'm not asking you to stay because the crown chose you," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay because the kingdom needs you. I'm not asking you to stay because the bond demands it." He paused. "I'm asking you to choose. Whatever you choose, I'll live with it, but the choice is yours." Nora stood in the great hall of the Ashenvale Palace, with crown light in her hair and wolf strength in her bones and a bond singing in her chest that connected her to a man who was giving her the one thing nobody had ever given her before. Not a crown, not a kingdom, not a destiny wrapped in silver and obligation. A door she could walk through or walk away from, and the absolute certainty that both options were real. She stayed, not for the crown, not for the kingdom that needed its queen, not for the mate bond that hummed in her blood and his blood, and the space between them where something new was being built. She stayed, because for the first time in 24 years, the staying was hers. The crown sat on her head, the wards burned bright along every border, the wolves howled in the north and the south and the east and the west, a sound that carried across the entire kingdom and said the same thing in every direction. She's here. She's home. The bone setter from Millhaven who came for 3 silver coins sat on the steps of the ruined hall, with a crown on her head and a king beside her, and she set one more fracture. The last one, her own,